Have you ever wondered how Christianity, one of the world's major religions, split into two of its largest branches, Roman Catholic and Protestant? Well, it all goes back to a single protest over 500 years ago. And believe me, this wasn't just some minor disagreement. It was a full-blown revolution in faith that changed, well, pretty much everything. Let's dive into how it all went down.
So that's really the big question for us today, isn't it? How did this happen? How did a faith that was, for the most part, unified for over 1,000 years just splinter into these competing traditions? The story, as you'll see, is all about power, belief, and one very brave monk who dared to challenge the entire system.
Okay, so to really get the split, we first have to understand what things were like before it happened. For centuries in Western Europe, you didn't really have a choice of Christian churches. There was just the church. And the authority of the Roman Catholic Church was honestly immense. I mean, it traced its lineage all the way back to Jesus Christ and his apostle Peter, who Catholics believe was the very first pope. With its power centered in Rome, the church wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a dominant political and cultural force across the continent. And we're not talking about a short-lived reign here. We're talking about more than 1,000 years. An entire millennium where the Catholic Church was the unquestioned center of European life. It guided everything from art and science to the laws of the land and the daily lives of everyone, from kings down to peasants.
So, what did people believe back then? Well, the core ideas were pretty clear-cut. Spiritual authority didn't just come from the Bible, it also came from the traditions of the church itself. The Pope was seen as God's man on earth, his spiritual leader. And getting into heaven, that required not just faith, but also performing good works and participating in the church's sacred rituals, the sacraments, like baptism and communion.
But by the 1500s, even the strongest foundations can start to crack. And this massive ancient institution was definitely starting to show some serious wear and tear. A quiet but growing unhappiness was brewing among ordinary people. And what's so interesting about this time is that the problems weren't hidden at all. They were right there in the open. There was widespread corruption. Some church leaders were living these incredibly lavish lives, which was a pretty stark contrast to the humility they were supposed to be preaching. But the issue that really lit the fuse was the selling of something called indulgences. So you're probably asking, what on earth is an indulgence? Well, think of it like this. It was basically a certificate you could buy from the church, and it promised to reduce the time you or even a loved one who had already passed away would have to spend being punished for sins. To a lot of people, it looked an awful lot like the church was selling salvation, literally putting a price tag on God's forgiveness. You can imagine, this practice felt deeply, deeply wrong to a lot of people. But here's the thing, challenging the church? That was like challenging the very fabric of reality itself. It was a dangerous, almost unthinkable thing to do. So the question hanging in the air was, who would ever be brave enough to actually speak out? And that brings us to the man who lit the match, a German monk and professor named Martin Luther, and the document that would end up changing the world, the 95 Theses. The big moment came in 1517. With all this discontent just simmering below the surface, Martin Luther nailed a list of 95 arguments against the sale of indulgences to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany. Now, he just wanted to start a debate among scholars, but what he got instead was a firestorm. This one act is what we now see as the official start of the Protestant Reformation. So what was Luther's big revolutionary idea? It was this. Salvation, he argued, couldn't be earned or bought. It was a free gift from God, and you received it through faith alone. This was a bombshell. It directly attacked the church's teaching that good works and sacraments were also required. And here's the other knockout punch. Luther declared that the one and only source of religious authority was the Bible itself. This idea is sometimes called sola scriptura. What this meant was that the Pope and all the church's traditions were no longer the ultimate authority. This was a radical shift that really empowered regular people to read and interpret the Bible for themselves. As you can probably guess, this didn't exactly lead to a polite, peaceful debate. Thanks to the brand new invention of the printing press, Luther's ideas spread like wildfire, and Europe was plunged into a long, dark period of conflict and war. The aftermath was just brutal. Europe was torn apart by decades of religious wars. Entire nations split right down the middle, as kings and princes had to choose, stay loyal to the Pope or adopt this new Protestant faith,
a name that came from those who protested the church's authority. It was a massive power struggle for hearts and minds. So, did the Catholic Church just sit back and watch this happen? Absolutely not. It launched its own powerful response, a period of renewal and reform that we now call the Counter-Reformation. And the centerpiece of this whole effort was a series of meetings called the Council of Trent. And their response was really a three-step plan. First, they worked on reform from within, tackling the very corruption that Luther had called out. Second, they reaffirmed their core beliefs, basically doubling down on things like the Pope's authority and the importance of all 7 sacraments. And finally, they worked to strengthen the Church's overall structure to ensure it would survive and thrive for centuries to come.
So, after all that fire, all that conflict, where does that leave us today? Well, it brings us to the modern world, where these two major Christian traditions have learned to coexist, side by side.
This table really breaks down the legacy of the Reformation perfectly. You can see Catholics still look to both the Bible and church tradition, and they see the Pope as their spiritual leader. Protestants, on the other hand, really emphasize the Bible alone and don't have a single unifying leader. And of course, there are still key differences in things like the number of sacraments and how salvation is understood. But, and this is so important to understand about our world today, despite all the historical division and the different doctrines, these two traditions are built on a shared foundation. They both believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ. They both hold the Bible as their holy book. And they both agree that salvation ultimately comes through faith in him.
And really, that's the story. What started as a protest for reform ended up creating two distinct paths within Christianity. Today, those paths often run parallel, coexisting with a shared core belief at their heart. And that incredible, centuries-long story of fracture, of conflict, and eventually of coexistence continues to shape our world in ways we're still seeing today.